The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue discussing Father Robert Spitzer's book, Science of the Doorstep to God. This is a book which is fairly deep, I would say, both scientifically and philosophically. Whether we look at the scientific evidence that he's presenting for supporting or complementing one's belief in God, or the metaphysical proofs that he gives, kind of a modern reformulation of Thomas Aquinas' proofs of the existence of God, or his 5 ways to prove. So it's worth discussing, but it's challenging. We left off after the introduction, so now we're on chapter 1, the science point to a beginning of our universe, ? Well, the answer is yes, it does, in 2 different ways, which are correlated. Just to kind of give an overview, one of them is that the scientific observations which lead to the conclusion that the universe is expanding. So if the universe is expanding and not going to contract because it's getting further and further expanded, well, then there had to be a beginning, because you can't expand infinitely. You be where we are. So that's one side of the proof. The other one is entropy. I'll just say a few things about that before we get into it, because entropy is an important concept. Basically, the first law of thermodynamics, when we say law, we mean that these are observations scientists have made. It's always been the case. That doesn't prove it always will be the case, but it's the best science can do, is that you never lose energy. Energy is conserved. There's no more or less than there was at the beginning. But the second law is that it always is degraded. It loses its ability to do things. It gets to a lesser form of concentration or organization. So, for example, take a very simple example. You fill your tank of gas here in the Bay Area, and you drive from San Francisco to San Jose. It's about 50 miles. So let's say you use 2 gallons of gas. That's chemical energy. And that energy has disappeared. Where did it go? It went to heat and friction on the road, the engine. And once the engine cools down again, where's that energy? It's heat dispersed. So you haven't lost any energy. It's just changed its form from concentrated, usable chemical energy to unusable heat energy. The point is, you can't now take that heat energy and to drive back to San Francisco. It's no longer in a form that is usable. So entropy means, like your desk or my bedroom, always greater disorganization. And then, therefore, inability to do work, so to speak.
Speak for yourself. I do have a question about entropy, though, because possible. The way I'm grasping this book, generally speaking, is when he offers, metaphors, analogies, a literary way of getting at the mathematics, which are above me. But you mentioned Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs, and obviously what we're looking at here are sort of 20th century and 21st century physics as leading us to a belief in God. But I'm guessing, and I don't know much about the history of science, but I'm guessing that Thomas Aquinas knew nothing about the laws of thermodynamics, the law of entropy. I mean, he would have observed something which we call entropy, of course. Everybody had known that. But as a scientific law, does that go back to Newton?
No, the scientific law does not, but the awareness that the universe is running downhill is ancient. In fact, in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, he talks about, and the cosmos is groaning under its weight of slavery and corruption. So it's always been known that things go downhill, like you and me, and not yet Vivian, but she'll get there pretty soon. So the general idea that things fall apart if you don't take care of them, that's been known. But I'm not sure when it was formulated as a second law of thermodynamics, probably at Newton's time or after Newton.
So basically, that Thomas Aquinas would have had observed the same process of, shall we say, decay as Newton, but that it hadn't been formulated, should we say, mathematically in the manner in which it was done. Is that fair?
Yes, and also I believe, I think it's true that Thomas Aquinas said that philosophically, we cannot know whether the universe is eternal or created in time. But even if it's eternal, time extends back without end. It still is contingent and dependent upon God. So God would have to be eternally creating it. So it's true that Thomas did not say philosophically that we could come to the conclusion that the universe had a beginning in time.
That's interesting.
So what the scientists are showing, though, is that it had to, in another, kind of Grobe in German, I don't know how to say, Thomas, gross or rough analogy, is that a clock. Now, in the olden days, when I was a youth, they used to have wind-up clocks and watches, where you'd take your clock and you'd wind it up, there'd be a spring there, and it would keep going, and then it would run down, and you wind up again. Well, if the universe is winding down, it can't be winding down eternally. That is, if there's no beginning, then we're as far away from anything as we could get, and the clock would have run down by now. So the idea is that if your wind-up clock is running down, there was a time when you had to wind it up. If the universe is running down, it can't have been running down forever. There had to be some time when it was wound up. So that's again, in a very
the other thing, just analogously, that if entropy means that eventually we'll come to this primal inability for energy to do anything, I don't know what the correct terminology is.
Yes.
In other words, if it's going to come to an end and come to this equilibrium, then it had to logically have had a beginning, right? Because otherwise, if it's eternal, it would never get to the end, right? By definition.
If it was eternal, we'd already be there. That is to say, if it's finite, it's always running down for eternity. It would have run down by now.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the entropic, scientific evidence. But again, I want to always bring this back to our attention that, and Father Spitzer does explain that here in this book, that since scientific laws, as they're called, are based on induction from experience of particular events in particular places, you can never know for sure they're true because you haven't been to all particular events and places. So how do we know that entropy works on Mars or in another galaxy, Andromeda, whatever? Well, we don't, except that we are convinced that nature's uniform. That is, if we can discover patterns here based on the initial conditions, then we are convinced although it's a belief and not a proof, that will apply everywhere in the universe. And again, I keep referring to C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, where he says that conviction that nature's uniform is something that science can't give us. It has to come from something else. And of course, for Lewis, he says, well, if we believe in a God who's logos, our minds are reflections of his, then the universe, if we couldn't stand to be, that things were chaotic and the laws didn't work, is the kind of universe you wouldn't want to create. But again, all science is based on an unscientific principle that the laws of nature are uniform. And the laws that we know from our experience now are, number one, that there's a fixed amount of energy in the universe. And number two, that it's always going to a lower and lower degree of effectiveness.
Right.
The entropy is discussed on page 47 and 48, if someone wants to
Well, yeah,
see it in detail.
we should probably take the first thing first.
Oh, I see. You just sort of gave the overarching, here are these two things.
There's two arguments he's giving you. One is entropy, and that is section 3,
right,
page 45. And the other one is page 33, the final universe in Monsignor also Matra, where it was the Catholic priest, Monsignor, who first came up with the theory that the universe is expanding. Why did he come up with that theory? He mentions it here, but just to kind of express it in a way maybe a little more concrete and more simplistic, really, is that different elements show up differently on a spectrogram. That is, they emit radiation, and different elements emit radiation at different places on the spectrogram. And so you look at these things and you see these lines. Well, that's hydrogen, that's beryllium, that's cadmium, and they're on a specific spot. So many. The frequency is a certain fixed frequency. Well, when we were able telescopically to see the radiation emitted from these stars and galaxies and so on, we see the familiar spectrogram that has all those lines on it, exactly spaced apart like they are here, but they're shifted. They all are showing a lower frequency. Well, what could that possibly mean? It's a Doppler effect. In the old days, when trains had whistles, maybe they still do, you'd hear a train coming, woo, as it goes away. Why? As the train's coming towards you, the sound waves are compressed. It's a higher frequency. As it's going away from you, they're extended, and it's a lower frequency. So it sounds higher when it's coming towards you, lower going away from you. So now we have light, which isn't sound, but it has frequencies. And so as they looked at these stars and these galaxies, they would notice that the further away they are, how they tell that, that's another question, the more there was a shift. All these lines were shifted to a lower frequency, which meant that they're moving away from us. And the further away they were, the bigger the shift. And so that's where Lemaitre said, wait a minute, how do we explain this? Well, these stars must be moving away. And so and it's in every direction. And we know we're not the center. So basically, the universe is expanding in all directions so that wherever you look, the farther you look, the lower the frequency of the various element radiations are. And therefore, they came to the conclusion that the universe is expanding. So that led to the Big Bang Theory, because if it's expanding, well, where did it expand from? Now you what's the word for this? You calculate backwards. Well, if it went from here to here in so many thousand years, well, then we go backwards in time until we figure out, well, what was the beginning? When did this thing start? And they estimate, the scientists do, 13.8 billion years ago. That was when the Big Bang occurred. So this first part of the book, the Boltzmann, he's got a name for it here, I keep forgetting the name, the Borde-Blanken-Guth theorem, is that the universe, the cosmos as a whole, is showing a positive number for expansion, because it could be contracting, but if it's expanding, well, then it had to be a beginning, because because that's the observational data is the red shift, it's called, in the spectrum when you look at the stars in the sky from a telescope, and therefore we conclude from that what's the cause of that. They must be moving away from us in an accelerating way. The big question for years was, well, what if it expands and then contracts again? The big bounce, so we're in an expansion phase. But even then, you take a ball and you drop a rubber ball, you drop it down, it bounces back, and then less and less and less. Why? Because of entropy. So that even if it's a bouncing universe, and even if entropy, and that law is universal, then it will eventually run down. Therefore, it's not eternal. Therefore, it had a beginning. So that's kind of the argument for a beginning from science, based both on universe expansion and entropy.
Yeah, and Father, thanks for that overview, which makes things very clear. And so the other thing that makes things clear for me in this is when scientists or Father Spitzer resort to metaphor, to visual images, because that works for me. So at the top of page 35, we have Father Lemaitre explaining the Big Bang. He says, we can compare space-time to an open conic cup. The bottom of the cup is the origin of atomic disintegration. It is the first instant at the bottom of space-time, the now which has no yesterday, because yesterday there was no space. I mean, again, it's one sentence and two sentences, and it makes things very, very clear visually for me. And obviously, I'm clearly a visual person when it comes to dealing with science. So that's very helpful for me, as was your overview.
One thing I like about what Father Spitzer is doing here is notice how the chapter title is, Does Science Point to a Beginning of Our Universe? Not does science prove, not does science disprove, because he already spelled out what the limits of science actually are, So now he's very careful to observe those limits himself in the way he even writes about these things. So he's showing that if you take all these things together, all these observations together from all these different people, and if you even consider these really wild attempts to show otherwise, like Bozeman brains and all these other things you're like, okay, you don't want to believe in God, but you're going to believe in that. Okay. But, he's very careful to say, I'm not disproving. What I am saying is that if you take all these observations together, it points to first of all, a beginning. And then once we've established that that's a reasonable thing to believe, a beginning, well, then the next question is how or what caused it to begin? And so it's very reasonable. It's very measured. It's very, in that sense, it's easy to follow. I have to say, a lot of this stuff is over my head. I don't have a background in physical sciences. So, but when I just see how measured and how he doesn't go beyond what the limits are himself, it gives me a lot of confidence that he knows what he's talking about.
Well, I will say later on in some passages, I think he actually is too modest in some places.
Oh, interesting.
There are certain places where science knows more than he gives it credit for. But that you only had a sentence on page 31 at the top, so let's go through that, because that kind of summarizes his approach. Science, contrary to popular belief, does not contradict the beginning of our universe or physical reality itself. Rather, it uncovers considerable evidence for beginning. That is, doesn't prove it. A beginning that suggests a transcendent creator. That's what science can do. You know? And so, since scientists are all human beings, and even AI, so-called artificial intelligence, is human beings. So it goes into the system by human beings and comes out, you know. But we have to be careful when we hear what scientists say, whether they're speaking as a scientist based on scientific evidence, or, which is perfectly normal, as human beings, they are drawing conclusions from that evidence which are not scientific, but rather philosophical, or I would say basically human.
Yeah, that's very good. The other thing, by the way, I just want to make a poetic point. I know I'm trying to bring literature into this scientific discussion here, but when Vivian says that does science point to a beginning of our universe, I think there's a double entendre on the word point there, right? It's pointing in this sense, but the point is the Big Bang, right? The conical, the bottom of the conical, right? That is pointing to a point. And that's the point, should we say?
Very good.
I do want to mention one thing on page 31 again here. He talks about an abductive argument, which I think is an interesting way of expressing things. But, you know, what would be the noun for abductive?
Abduction.
Abduction. Well, so.
But it's not a kidnapping.
I know. So abduction is not really the kind of thing you want to do here. But by abductive instead of deductive or inductive, he means this, that if we see certain things I mentioned in our last session, we look at all the planets in our solar system and we look at their motions relative to each other and we say, something's off here. There's some other element that's causing this. If this was all the planets that there were in our solar system, we predict this and this and this, but that's not what we get. There's got to be something else there, which is causing this. So in a certain sense, it's induction and deduction, but he calls it abduction. Basically, it's a conclusion because we know the laws that are applying in our solar system, and all these planets almost conform, but not quite. There must be some other factor that we're not aware of. And that was when they said, well, there's got to be a planet out there somewhere. It's got to be about this size in this place. And they found it. They said, well, here's what it should be. And they looked, well, lo and behold, there it was.
Pluto.
So, but before they saw Pluto, their argument that there must be a Pluto was abductive. Based on their inductive experience, there was something that must be there which they couldn't observe.
This was a new word for me, abductive. Yeah. So I looked it up in the dictionary. You know, I encourage people to look up things in the dictionary when they don't know what it means. And here was the Webster's definition.
Okay.
A logical inference that seeks the most likely conclusion from a set of observations.
There you go.
There you go.
So there you go. Observations, you're trying to conclude to something, and what's the most likely reason for it?
Right.
But again, I want to keep insisting on this because it's something we all use every day, all the time when we're thinking.
We do.
It's taken for granted. But basically, when things occur, there must be some reason for it. That is to say, there must be some cause for it, and that cause must be adequate. That's why we know when we found the answer, because we know something had to cause this. I use this example in class, you know, hey, if the water starts rising in this room, we know there's a cause, right? Well, it's not that ant across the table. He couldn't do it. It's not the lights up there. It could be the plumbing. You know, it could be leakage in the roof, you know, but we know what kind of answers to the question will satisfy us and what ones won't. Why is that? Because we know that every event has to have an adequate, a sufficient cause. And that it's an important philosophical factor, which is part of our, if we didn't accept that, then all reasoning disappears because, you know, if, the there's footprints across the floor, muddy footprints, and the mom says, "Johnny, did you do that?" No, they just happened. They just happened. I'm not involved.
Yeah. Well, you also demonstrated with your example of the water that correlation does not prove causation. So you've got the water rising from somewhere, and you've got the ant at the same time crawling across the table. And just because they're happening simultaneous doesn't mean the ant crawling across the table is causing the rising water. So that sometimes people will pull that on you, right? They show you a correlation example of correlating things, and then they'll say, therefore, that's causing that. Well, not necessarily.
The worst case scenario of that, a bad scenario consequence of that is a lot of the conspiratorial understanding of history, right? You start off with a presupposition, right? And then the whole of history is made to fit that presupposition. So this person did that then, this person did that then, and somehow there's a connection. You haven't proved the connection.
Yeah.
But you started with a presupposition, and then you're making the whole of history fit your presupposition.
Right. And then since we're on the topic of reasoning, reasoning your way through these things, the person making that observation or statement, the burden of proof is on him. The burden of proof is on him to prove that what he's saying is true. The burden of proof is not on me to disprove it.
No.
Right? It's a disprovable thing. You have to prove it. I don't have to disprove it. So, but a lot of times people who have these sorts of theories or ideas, they sort of demand you to disprove it. No.
Right.
And on this topic, it's an important topic. There's a famous expression, post hoc ergo propter hoc. Because something happened, one event happened after another event, we say, well, it was caused by that. That's not necessarily true. Here's an example.
Right. Chronology is not causation.
Yeah. So I happen to think that, the COVID injections did cause myocarditis in some people. I can't be sure of that. I know that some people had shots and they got myocarditis afterwards. That doesn't prove it came from the shot.
Right.
It could have come from Mars or from their genes or from all kinds of other reasons. So just because one thing happened after another does not mean it was caused by the other.
That's right.
On a personal subjective level, on this point, is that our son Leo was born with Down syndrome. He wasn't born with autism. No, he developed or got autism when he was about 3 years old, 2 or 3 years old, and it was after that he had been given the MMR vaccine. Now Susanna is convinced that one caused the other. I'm inclined to agree, but I'm agnostic because I don't pontificate about things I can't prove. We can't prove that the fact he had the vaccine caused the autism, but we do know that he didn't have autism, and now he does have autism, and something that happened between the two was the vaccine. Now, whether one caused the other, we can't prove that.
And that's what leads science to investigation. You try to do you do studies, and you try and find what the causes are, what the linkages are.
Right.
It's like, does smoking cause lung cancer? Well, we always thought it might have an effect on it, but now we're much more certain that we know the chain of causality that leads to what happens to your lungs with the tar in there and so on, that it can lead to cancer. So that's the glory of science, is to take these events which may have been caused by this and try to disprove it, falsify it, or find evidence for it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it turns out there's been a number of solid studies on the myocarditis. Yeah. Which is why certain vaccines were outlawed in Europe. And so then the thing that always arouses your suspicion is when people do want to investigate something and they get the slap down from from big vested interests that don't want people digging into this, and maybe
right. And the fact it's big government, big business that pays for most of scientific research is already going to guarantee that we're not going to get an objective scientific approach to problems.
Yeah, it's hard to as you say, look for sources you can trust. I do listen to this Vinay Prasad, who's a professor of biostatistics here at UCSF.
Yes, I'm impressed.
And he's right down the street from us where Ignatius Press is. And he has some pretty solid, he's a good person for parsing out when studies are good and strong and when they're not. And so just pass that on.
Yep. So this is, but we are discussing things which are very relevant to our lives in this book, although they may not be completely clearly, related to a particular text. But it's
this is a book about sound reasoning, actually.
That's true, it is.
That's my takeaway. I'm not going to remember all these theories and all these scientists.
Yeah. But it's also about sound reasoning in terms of physics as opposed to metaphysics. And there's a lot of philosophy in this as well. But the thing about this is, how relevant is science, the physical sciences, to our understanding of reality? And that's what this book is prompting us to think about. So if we go off on tangents that are applicable, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, quite frankly.
No, I agree with you.
All right, thank you.
Plus, we're having fun.
Yeah.
As well.
And we hope you are out there, whoever you are, that you're enjoying it too. But yeah.
Now, you can tell that Father Spitzer has been a teacher for some time because he repeats himself a lot. But he's dealing with fairly abstruse, deep things, and I think it's important to have those repetitions. I want to go to page 38, the new paragraph there, just because he kind of summarizes what he's going to be doing here. This brings us to three central questions. Was the Big Bang the beginning of our universe? Does the universe exhaust a whole of physical reality, or is there some dimension of physical reality beyond the universe? And three, if physical reality does extend beyond the universe, must it have a beginning? So, again, he's very thorough here. We know what our observations are for the universe that we have around us, but did it have a beginning? Is this all there is? And if there's more than this, why did it have a beginning? Those are important questions. But as you said earlier, Vivian, trying to explain this universe, which we now know had to have a beginning, we'll get to that later, scientifically, rather than say, well, there must be something outside the universe that's causing this, they'll go to all these strange multiverses, infinite multiverses. Really?
I thought the Bozeman brain.
The Bozeman brain
was the took the cake.
I mean, some of these are more bizarre than the wackiest science fiction novels. I mean,
And so, but that's when scientists are now acting not as scientists, but as human beings who do not want to accept the results of the science they've been doing.
Right.
Father, as timekeeper, may I suggest that we
okay.
To the next,
wherever we are now, let's stop.
Well, yeah.
But I think, Father, actually, by way of conclusion, those three questions on page 38 that you've just read and then reiterated, you were practicing what Father Spitzer does by you repeated what he said. I mean, that's a good. Those three questions, I think, were a good way to end this episode. And begin the next. I mean, if you want to read them again by way of begging the questions that we want to.
Good.
Shall I do that? Shall I read those three questions again? As
I will. At the beginning of the new session, God said, "Fiat lux," and there was light. I say, "Fiat finis," and there was an end. Thanks, everybody. See you later. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.